Cuba, a vibrant island, a fusion of diverse cultures, traditions, and histories. At the heart of its identity is the Afro-Cuban community, whose contributions to music, dance, and religion are central to Cuban culture. But behind the rhythm and colors lies a story entrenched in slavery. A story of survival, resistance, and freedom. One that reshaped the island's social and economic fabric forever. In the 18th century, Cuba's economy thrived on the forced labor of enslaved Africans. Sugar mills and tobacco plantations generated immense wealth, paid for with human suffering. Like elsewhere in the Americas, slavery in Cuba was a brutal institution, designed to dehumanize and oppress through forced labor, violence, and exploitation. While Cuban slavery mirrored many of the brutalities common across the Atlantic world, it was marked by distinct contradictions. Colonial policies and legal loopholes blurred the rigid lines between enslavement and freedom, crafting a system that appeared more flexible than it truly was. These laws were designed to help Cuban planters and merchants maintain control over a growing enslaved population while projecting an idyllic image of Cuban slavery to the outside world. As stated in Powerful Subjects, The Duplicity of Slave Owners in 19th Century Cuba, written by historian and scholar of Atlantic slavery Manuel Barcia, from the late 1790s, Cuban authorities, merchants, and planters joined forces in a vain effort to portray Cuban slavery as a harmless and paternalistic institution, exempt from the brutalities that they shrewdly attributed to other slave systems in the Americas. Slave owners often argued that they were civilizing the otherwise savage Africans. Cuban priest Juan Bernardo Ogavan, who in 1820 traveled to Madrid specifically to sabotage the 1817 treaty between Britain and Spain aimed at ending the transatlantic slave trade, described Cuban slavery in strikingly idealized terms. The black man lives surrounded by his family, with his wife and children, in his house and in his fields. He has the freedom to go fishing and hunting, and when he is hardworking and has some talent, he enjoys some comfort and even a certain degree of luxury. When he falls sick, he is treated with great care. When he is old, far from the problems of his own subsistence and his family's, he is treated with generosity. When he gains the necessary money for his deliverance, he becomes a free man in disposition of all his faculties. Our special laws highly favor the good treatment and the freedom of the blacks, opening for them all the opportune roads. To conclude, these men, who would be indomitable wild beasts in Africa, learn and practice among us the precepts of the religion of peace, love, and sweetness, and become part of the great evangelical society. To escape the criticism of other slave societies, such as the rigid plantation systems in the United States, Cuba's slavery system offered, on paper, some limited opportunities for mobility through mechanisms like the peculium system. This system allowed enslaved people to earn money by working outside their masters' households or in urban markets, giving them a degree of economic autonomy. The peculium enabled enslaved individuals to control the money and property they earned, which they could use to help fund legal proceedings known as coartación, through which they could petition for their freedom. While the process of purchasing freedom was long and fraught with challenges, it provided a rare path to emancipation for some enslaved people. Additionally, the peculium allowed for the possibility of negotiating better treatment or seeking alternative work opportunities within the system. The peculium created opportunities for enslaved people to exercise small degrees of economic autonomy. However, it was not a guaranteed right, and many enslavers tightly controlled or confiscated these earnings. For a select few, this financial leverage made it possible to pursue coartación, a legal process for them to purchase their own freedom. Through coartación, an enslaved person could petition their enslaver to set a price for their freedom, negotiating installment payments. Once an initial down payment was made, the petitioner could attain the semi-free status of coartado, which conferred limited legal protections, including protection from resale or arbitrary re-enslavement. However, coartación was rife with exploitation. Though the law required a fair price, enslavers often set exorbitant sums, making full manumission nearly impossible. Some coartados remained in this semi-free status indefinitely, benefiting from its protections while ensuring their own financial stability. Yet, because they were still legally enslaved, their former owners continued to profit from their labor. Even for those who successfully bought their freedom, true liberation remained elusive. Many faced persistent discrimination, economic marginalization, and legal obstacles that kept them trapped in cycles of dependency. Richard Robert Madden, a British diplomat, Irish doctor, writer, abolitionist, and historian, even said, "The idea of a predial slave going to the mayoral, or overseer, and telling him he wants a paper, a permission for 2 or 3 days to seek another master, would be laughed at in Cuba. The unfortunate Negro who would make so daring an attempt to obtain his rights would in all probability be flogged on the spot. If he still presumed to talk of the law and insist on being taken before a magistrate to claim the privileges which the law gave him, he would then be treated with a degree of rigor beyond the law, as an insolent and rebellious slave. In 1867, Cuba officially ceased its participation in the transatlantic slave trade, yet slavery itself persisted. The Spanish crown, under international pressure, introduced the Moray Law in 1870 as a step towards gradual emancipation. Often called the Law of Free Wombs, it granted nominal freedom to children born to enslaved mothers after its passage. These children, however, were required to remain under their mother's enslaver until at least age 18, prolonging their subjugation. The law also freed enslaved people over the age of 60, those who had served in the Spanish military, and those owned directly by the Spanish government. While the Moray Law introduced some restrictions on corporal punishment, it primarily served as a measure to delay full abolition while maintaining the economic structures dependent on enslaved labor. Established in 1880, the Patronado system was meant to be a transitional framework leading to full emancipation. In reality, it functioned as an extension of slavery. Formerly enslaved individuals were forced to work for their former masters under exploitive conditions. Though they were promised wages and legal protections, the system ensured their dependency on former owners. The legal contradictions of emancipation were exemplified in the life of Dobo. In 1826, he was captured in West Africa by notorious slave trader Pedro Blanco and forced onto a Spanish slave ship, the Fingal. The British naval ship HMS Speedwell intercepted the Fingal, and Dobo was taken to Cuba, where he was labeled an emancipado. Supposedly free, he was instead placed in forced labor under a trustee. Renamed Gabino, he worked as a water carrier for a wealthy widow who bribed officials to keep him under her control for 15 years. Denied wages, freedom, and legal protections, Gabino sought help from British abolitionist David Turnbull, who confronted Spanish authorities. His case triggered a diplomatic crisis, and in 1841 he finally won his freedom. But just months later, colonial authorities accused him of conspiring in a black uprising. He was sentenced to exile in a Spanish prison in North Morocco. Gravely ill, he died shortly after arrival, once again a captive crossing the Atlantic. Dobo's story is not unique. Thousands of emancipados in Cuba remained enslaved under Spanish law. His life reveals how legal loopholes and colonial corruption kept Afro-Cubans in bondage, even after they were promised their freedom. Though Cuba officially ended slavery in 1886, the struggle for true freedom continued. Legal structures such as the Titulación and Esclavo Contrato system allowed for continued racial and economic exploitation. The Titulación system was intended to grant legal ownership of property and status to formerly enslaved people. However, bureaucratic obstacles often delayed or revoked titles, leaving many in legal uncertainty. Those who lacked titles remained vulnerable to labor exploitation and economic instability. Simultaneously, the Esclavo Contratado system permitted former enslavers to rehire freed individuals under restrictive contracts that closely resembled slavery. These agreements forced Afro-Cubans into long-term servitude, ensuring that former masters retained economic control over them. As Cuba's society changed and labor laws modernized, wage labor replaced older servitude-based models. The societal changes gradually reduced the power of former enslavers to contest the status of freed people. The legacy of slavery remains deeply ingrained in Cuban society. The racial and economic hierarchies built over centuries of forced labor did not disappear with emancipation. They adapted, continuing to marginalize Afro-Cubans through restricted access to land, education, and political representation. These systemic barriers reinforce cycles of poverty and inequality, the effects of which still persist today. In an interview with the Choices Program, a national education initiative affiliated with Brown University's Department of History,
race relations in 20th century Cuba is so complex because the activism of the Afro-Cuban population have made them an important part of modern citizenship in Cuba. But at the same time, the racism of the now Cubans make the relationship with these citizens a very complex one.
Only through continual acknowledgement of the past can we begin to dismantle the barriers it left behind, and ensure that Afro-Cuban voices are not just part of history, but part of the future being built today.